The town of Red Mesa had seen plenty of mail-order brides step off the stage, but none of them looked like her. None of them carried bruises hidden beneath cotton sleeves in the middle of July, and not one of them had ever looked at a stranger's outstretched hand like it might be a trap. Mabel Carter had traveled 600 miles across the American frontier to marry a man she'd never met, because anywhere had to be better than where she came from. She was wrong about a lot of things in her life, but not about that. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who should love you, stay with me. Like this video, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach hit a rut somewhere past the painted desert, and Mabel Carter's forehead knocked hard against the wooden frame of the window. She didn't cry out. She'd learned a long time ago that making noise only made things worse. She pressed 2 fingers to the spot above her eyebrow, felt the heat rising there, and looked back out at the land. Arizona Territory in August, red rock and white sky, and nothing for miles except scrub brush and the occasional dark shape of a hawk circling something dead below. The driver up top hadn't said more than 12 words since Flagstaff. The other passengers, a traveling salesman with an enormous mustache and a woman in widow's black who smelled of camphor, had both fallen asleep before noon. Mabel had not slept in 2 days. She pulled her shawl tighter across her shoulders despite the heat. It was cotton, dark blue, and she wore it for the same reason she'd been wearing long sleeves all summer, not because of the temperature. The letter in her coat pocket had been read so many times the creases had gone soft. She didn't need to read it again. She had memorized it in the way you memorize something you're not entirely sure you should believe. Miss Carter, I am not a man who is good with words on paper, but I will try to be honest with you. I have a working cattle ranch southeast of Red Mesa. I need a wife who is willing to work hard and be treated decently in return. I'm not looking for a pretty ornament. I'm looking for a partner. If that suits you, I would be glad to have you come. Gideon Cross. A partner. She had turned that word over in her mind for 3 weeks before writing back. Not a servant. Not something to look at. A partner. She'd written her reply at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning when her father was asleep and her 2 older brothers were out. She'd used the last of her good stationery. She had told Gideon Cross that she was 24 years old, that she could cook and sew and keep accounts, that she had grown up on a farm and was not afraid of hard work. She had not told him about her size because she was afraid he would cancel the arrangement, and by then she was already afraid that if she didn't leave Harlan County, Kentucky, she might not survive the year. That was 3 months ago. Now the stagecoach was slowing, the driver calling something down that she couldn't quite hear over the creak of the wheels, and Mabel straightened in her seat and pressed her hair back from her face and tried to remember what it felt like to be a person who deserved to be somewhere. Red Mesa was smaller than she'd expected. One main street with a general store, a livery, a barber, a saloon whose sign had lost 2 letters so it now read The Ront R, a church at the far end with a crooked steeple. The kind of town that looked like it had been dropped from a height and never quite settled straight. The stage stopped in front of the post office, and the driver climbed down and opened the door, and she was the last one out. She stepped onto the wooden platform and her legs ached from 2 days of sitting, and the heat hit her like a door swinging open on a furnace. She stood there a moment, holding her carpet bag and her small trunk, squinting against the sun, looking up and down the street. There were 3 men standing near the livery watching her. She heard one of them say something she couldn't make out, and then another one laughed, and she recognized that laugh. She had been hearing variations of that laugh her entire life. The one that meant, look at the size of her. The one that was never quite loud enough to call out, but always just loud enough to hear. She looked at the ground. Miss Carter? The voice came from her left, deep, a little rough, the kind of voice that had spent years calling out across open land. She turned. He was taller than she'd imagined. She hadn't imagined much, deliberately. She'd learned not to build pictures in her head of things she might not get to keep. But Gideon Cross was tall, lean in the way of men who work hard and don't sit still, with a face that had been weathered brown by sun and wind, dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a few days. His hat was off, held in both hands in front of him, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't frowning either. He was just looking at her, directly. Not at the rest of her, at her face. Yes, she said, Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "I'm Mabel Carter." He nodded once, slow. Then he looked at her trunk on the platform and back up at her. "You make it all right? Long trip." "I made it fine." He reached past her and picked up the trunk like it weighed nothing, tucked it under one arm, held out his other hand for the carpet bag. She hesitated. The habit of holding everything herself, of not letting anything go. And then she handed it over. "Wagon's this way," he said. She followed him. Behind her, she could feel the eyes of the three men still watching. She kept her back straight. No. The wagon ride to the ranch took 40 minutes. They didn't talk much. He pointed out a few landmarks. The mesa formation that gave the town its name, a dry creek bed that ran with water in spring, the spot where the road to Tucson branched off. She asked him how many head of cattle. He said 240 as of last count, but he'd had losses over the summer, a sickness that had moved through the herd before he'd caught it. He said it plainly, without drama, the way a man talks about a problem he has looked at from every angle and is still working on. She liked that. She had always distrusted men who pretended everything was fine. The ranch came into view past a long, low ridge, and it was not what she'd feared. She had built a grim picture in the back of her mind. Falling down structures, filth, the kind of neglect that comes from a man who doesn't care much about his surroundings. What she saw instead was a main house in decent repair, whitewashed, with a covered porch. 2 long bunkhouses set back from it, a big barn, a corral with horses moving lazily in the heat, a water tower, fenced paddocks. It wasn't beautiful, but it was cared for. Something about it settled her breathing just slightly. He pulled the wagon up to the front of the house and climbed down, and she climbed down without waiting for his hand, old reflex taking care of herself, and he didn't comment on it. "I'll show you the house," he said. "You can tell me what you need." Inside, the main room was plain and clean, a long wooden table, 4 chairs, a cast-iron stove, a shelf with a few books and a lantern, a braided rug on the floor. It smelled like wood and coffee and outside air. He took her to a room at the back of the house, small, with a single bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the back paddock, a hook on the wall for clothing. "This is your room," he said. She turned to look at him. "My room." "Your room." He said it again without blinking. "Door has a bolt on the inside. I sleep at the other end of the house." She stood there in the doorway looking at the small plain room and felt something she couldn't entirely name. Not happiness, exactly. Something more careful than that, like a muscle that has been clenched so long it doesn't know how to let go. "Mr. Cross," she said. "Gideon." "Gideon," she paused. "I should be honest with you about something." He waited. "I wrote to you about my skills. I didn't write to you about—" She stopped. She had practiced this. She had practiced it on the stagecoach and on the train before that, and lying awake in the boarding house in Flagstaff. "I'm aware that I'm not what most men would choose. I know what I look like. And I know there are men who write to agencies and expect something different from what arrives. I thought you should know that I know that, so that there's no misunderstanding." She was looking at the window when she said it, looking at the horses in the back paddock. Gideon Cross was quiet for a moment. "Miss Carter," he said. Then he stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. "I had a neighbor a couple years back, man named Presley. He ordered a wife through an agency in St. Louis. She arrived, and he looked at her, and the first thing out of his mouth, in front of the driver, in front of 2 of his hands, was that the agency had sent him damaged goods." He paused. "I'm not that man." Mabel turned from the window and looked at him. "I wrote you an honest letter," he said. "I expect you wrote me one. That's where we're starting from. Everything else we'll figure out." She didn't say anything for a moment. She was afraid to say anything, because the thing building in her chest felt dangerous, felt like the kind of hope that breaks you when it falls apart. "All right," she said. "There's water in the pitcher if you want to wash up. I'll have supper on around 7. He picked up her trunk and set it at the foot of the bed. "You need anything, I'll be in the barn." He left. She heard his boots on the wooden floor, the front door, and then outside. She sat down on the edge of the bed. The mattress was thin, but the frame was solid. The room was plain and small, and it had a bolt on the inside of the door. She put her face in her hands and did not cry, because she had also learned a long time ago that you don't use up tears on things that might still go wrong. She woke the next morning before the sun was fully up, which was habit, and lay still for a moment listening to the sounds of a place she didn't yet know. Birds she couldn't name, horses somewhere, the distant sound of someone moving around in a kitchen. She got up and washed her face and put on her second dress, a faded brown cotton that was practical if not pretty, and went out. Gideon was at the stove. There was coffee already made and biscuits from the night before warming on an iron pan. He looked up when she came in. "Didn't expect you this early," he said. "I'm always up early." She moved to the far side of the kitchen. "Can I do anything?" He handed her the coffee tin without ceremony and pointed to the cups. She poured two and set one by him, and he picked it up and drank it like a man who needs coffee the way a horse needs water. "I want to show you the operation today," he said. "If you're up for it. You don't have to decide anything yet about the arrangement, but you should know what you're looking at." "I'd like that." After breakfast, he took her through the ranch with the practical efficiency of someone who doesn't see the point of small talk when there's real information to share. He showed her the garden behind the house, overgrown, badly neglected, things that should have been producing weren't. He showed her the smokehouse, the root cellar, the storage in the barn. He introduced her to his two full-time ranch hands, a wiry young man named Dewey, who couldn't have been more than 19, and a weathered older man named Hatch, who had one of those faces that looks like it was carved rather than born. Hatch tipped his hat and said, "Ma'am?" Dewey said, "Pleasure, Miss Carter," and went red in the ears. She noticed that Gideon introduced her by name, without qualification. Not the woman I sent for or the bride candidate or anything else she might have feared. Just, "This is Mabel Carter. She'll be getting to know the place." Small thing. She held on to it. But she had been at the ranch for 3 days when she found out about his previous wife. It wasn't from him. It was from Dewey, who had the particular gift of 17-year-old boys for saying things without realizing they're significant. They were in the garden. She had started pulling the dead growth because she couldn't look at the waste of it without wanting to do something. And Dewey was nearby fixing a fence post, and he said, conversationally, "You're going to do better with those tomato beds than Clara ever did." She hated dirt under her nails. Mabel sat back on her heels. "Clara?" Dewey's face changed. He looked at the fence post. "Gideon's, his wife. She passed. Couple years back now. Fever." "I didn't know. He don't talk about it much." He drove the post harder than he needed to. "She was from back east. Had a hard time with the heat, with the work. It wasn't—" He stopped. "It wasn't easy for either of them, I think. That's all I know." Mabel looked back at the dead tomato vines. She thought about a woman who had hated dirt under her nails trying to survive in this place. She thought about Gideon Cross, watching someone he'd promised to take care of disappear. That evening at supper, she said, "I know about Clara. Dewey mentioned her. I'm sorry." He was quiet for a moment, looked at his plate. "He means well." "He does." Another silence. Then, "She was a good woman. It wasn't a good match. Not her fault. Not mine. We just—" He pressed his fork against the edge of his plate. "She wanted something different from this life. I couldn't give it to her. And you're worried I'll want the same." He looked at her, direct. "Aren't you?" Mabel considered the question. She thought about her father's house in Harlan County, the small bedroom with no lock on the door, the way her brothers would come home drunk, and the way she'd learned to make herself invisible, to take up as little space as possible, to stay quiet, to endure. She thought about the train station in Louisville when she'd bought her ticket west and stood on the platform with her carpet bag, and felt, for the first time she could remember, like a person going somewhere rather than a person trapped in place. "I don't want to go back east," she said. "I don't want pretty things or a quiet life or to be somewhere soft." She picked up her coffee cup. "I want to work. I want to matter to a place. I've never had that." He watched her for a moment. Then he looked back down at his plate. "Fair enough," he said. At the end of her first week, she started on the root cellar inventory. It was disorganized in the way of things managed by someone who is too busy to think ahead. Stores in the wrong order, things rotting that should have been used, space wasted on empty vessels. She spent a full day pulling everything out and cataloging it on paper, then reorganizing by type and by season's end date. When Gideon came in and saw what she'd done, he stood in the cellar doorway for a long moment. "This would have taken me a month to get to," he said. "I noticed." "How did you know what needed to go first?" "My mother's root cellar. We had to be smart about what we had because there wasn't much." She marked something on her list. "You've got enough stores to carry you through winter if nothing else goes wrong. But you're low on salt and the dried beans are questionable. I'd go to the general store before the first hard frost." He didn't say thank you exactly. He made a sound that wasn't quite a word, and he looked at the shelves, and then he looked at her, like he was recalculating something. She went back to her list. 3 weeks in, she learned about her ribs. She had been favoring her left side without thinking about it. Old habit, old injury, the kind of thing your body just does. And she was lifting a sack of grain in the barn, and Hatch was nearby, and she made a sound without meaning to, and Hatch put down what he was doing. "You're hurt," he said. Not a question. "I'm fine." "That ain't what I asked." He looked at her with the unvarnished directness of a man who has seen too much to pretend. "How bad?" She looked at the grain sack. "Old injury? It's mostly healed." "Mostly." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Gideon know?" "It's not his business." Hatch picked up the grain sack without being asked and moved it to where it needed to go. He didn't say anything else about it, but she could see him thinking. Later that evening, when she came in from the garden, she found that the heavier water buckets by the porch had been moved closer to the pump, which she hadn't asked anyone to do. She didn't acknowledge it. Neither did anyone else. But that was the first time it occurred to her that there were people here who were watching out for her in the sideways manner of people who understand that dignity sometimes requires pretending not to notice. But on a Tuesday evening, 6 weeks after her arrival, Gideon Cross came into the kitchen where she was finishing the supper dishes, and he stood in the doorway in the particular way of a man who has something to say and isn't sure how to start. She turned from the basin and looked at him, and waited. "I had a letter from a woman in Prescott," he said. "Agnes Whitmore. She's on the church board. She says there's talk." "What kind of talk?" He looked uncomfortable. "The kind that says an unmarried woman living in a man's house is, well, the kind that says it's not appropriate, and that it reflects poorly on me and on you both if we don't—" He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm not saying this to pressure you. I want to be clear about that. I'm saying it so you know what's being said." Mabel dried her hands on the dish towel. She had heard similar things her whole life, that she was too big, too plain, too loud about what she thought, too much of whatever was wrong with her at a given moment. She was tired of other people's opinions operating as facts. "What do you want?" she asked him. "Not Agnes Whitmore. You." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to stay," he said. "I want you to stay because you want to, not because you feel like you have to." She folded the dish towel. "And if I said yes, what would that look like?" "It would look like—" He frowned. Not at her, at the floor. "It would look like I'd tell Agnes Whitmore to mind her own affairs, and we'd get a license from the county clerk, and we'd get on with building what we've started here." He looked up. "I'm not good at talking about what I feel. I know that. But I'm here every day and I see what you do and I think—" He stopped again, shook his head. "I think you're the first person I've met in a long time who isn't pretending." Mabel stood at the kitchen basin in the fading evening light with her dish towel in her hands and thought about the letter she had written in the dark at 2 a.m. to a stranger who said he was looking for a partner. And she thought about the bolt on the inside of her door and the grain sacks that had been moved without comment and the way this man looked at her face when he spoke to her instead of anywhere else. "I'd want to keep my room," she said. He blinked. Then he said, "That's your room. That doesn't change. And I'd want it to be understood that I don't take orders. I'll work alongside you and I'll be honest with you and I'll put everything I have into this place, but I'm not—" Her voice dropped just slightly. "I'm not going back to being someone who takes orders and stays quiet." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mabel, look at the cellar inventory on my desk." She waited. "I haven't touched it because it's yours, your system, your logic. If you'd written it different, I'd have asked you why, not told you to do it over." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you to be someone's shadow." She looked at him for a long time. A man who had lost one wife to this hard country and was standing in his kitchen asking a woman he'd known 6 weeks to stay and saying it quietly, without theater, the way people say things when they actually mean them. "All right," she said. "All right?" "Yes." She put the dish towel over the edge of the basin. "Yes, I'll stay." He stood there for a moment as though he'd prepared for more resistance and didn't know what to do with the absence of it. Then he nodded, once the way he did when something was settled. "I'll go to the clerk's office Thursday," he said. "I'll need something to wear that isn't work clothes." "We'll go to the general store Wednesday." She almost said, "You don't have to do that." And then she stopped herself, because that was the old reflex, and the one that said, "Don't ask for anything, don't expect anything, stay small." She pressed her mouth together and let the moment stand. "Good," she said. Wednesday. But she was in bed that night with the bolt on the door shot home and the window open to the slight cooling of a desert evening when she thought about what her father would say if he could see her. Big, shameless Mabel, who could never make herself small enough, who had eaten too much and laughed too loud and taken up too much space in every room she'd ever entered, who had packed one carpet bag and one small trunk and bought a train ticket with money she'd been putting away for 3 years from small jobs and quietly saved scraps and gotten out. She thought about what he'd say. Then she thought about a root cellar reorganized by someone who'd always been told she was too stupid to be trusted with important things. She thought about 240 head of cattle and a man who said, "That's your system, your logic." She thought about a bolt on the inside of a door. She closed her eyes. Outside, an owl called once somewhere past the corral and was quiet. She slept. They got married on a Thursday morning in October with no ceremony worth the name. The county clerk's office in Red Mesa smelled like dust and old paper, and the particular staleness of a room where windows are never opened. The clerk was a thin man named Aldous Fry, who wore spectacles that kept sliding down his nose, and who looked at Mabel the way people look at something that doesn't quite fit the category they've prepared for it. He pushed the spectacles up, looked at her, looked at Gideon, looked back at the paper in front of him. "Both parties present and consenting?" he said, in the flat tone of a man who has asked this question 400 times. "Yes," said Gideon. "Yes," said Mabel. Aldous Fry wrote something, had them sign, wrote something else, had Gideon pay the fee, stamped the paper with a stamp so worn the impression barely showed, and handed over the certificate. The whole thing took 11 minutes. Mabel counted. Outside on the wooden sidewalk, Gideon held the certificate in one hand and his hat in the other and looked at the street and then at her. "That's done," he said. "That's done," she agreed. He put his hat back on. She smoothed the front of her dress, the new one from the general store, dark green cotton with small buttons at the collar, the first new piece of clothing she had owned in 3 years. He had not commented on it when she came out of her room that morning, but he had looked at her for a moment in a way that she catalogued and moved on from, because she was still in the habit of not building too much out of small things. They drove back to the ranch in the wagon. He asked her if she wanted to eat somewhere in town first, and she said she'd rather get back, and he said fine, and they didn't talk much for the rest of the ride. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have agreed to something real and are sitting with the weight of it. Hatch and Dewey were both in the yard when they pulled in, which Mabel suspected was not an accident. Dewey had made an effort with his hair. Hatch had his hat off. "Well?" Dewey said. "Done," said Gideon, climbing down. Dewey broke into a grin wide enough to split his face. "About time." He looked at Mabel. "Welcome official, Mrs. Cross." The name hit her somewhere strange. Not badly, just strangely, like putting on a coat that doesn't quite know your shape yet. "Thank you, Dewey," she said. Hatch said nothing, but he gave her a nod that carried something in it she recognized as respect. And from Hatch, that was more than most people got. What she hadn't expected was Agnes Whitmore. The woman arrived 3 days after the wedding in a wagon driven by her husband, a quiet, apologetic-looking man named Theodore, who appeared to have made peace with his role in life, which was to drive Agnes places and not speak. Agnes herself was somewhere between 50 and 60, broad-shouldered, iron-haired, with the particular manner of a woman who has appointed herself the moral record-keeper of an entire community and taken the job seriously for decades. She brought a pie. Apple, which Mabel thought was either a genuine gesture or a very pointed one. Mabel answered the door because Gideon was in the east paddock and she was the one who heard the wagon coming up the drive. Agnes looked at her, up and down. The look lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but Mabel had been receiving variations of that look her entire life, and she could read it the way a river pilot reads a current, the quick calculation, the comparison against expectation, the conclusion drawn and filed away. "You must be Mrs. Cross," Agnes said. Her voice was not unkind. That was almost worse. "I am. Would you like to come in?" Agnes came in. She looked at the main room with the careful eye of someone conducting an inspection and calling it a social call. Mabel put the kettle on and found 2 cups and set the pie on the table and sat down across from Agnes Whitmore and waited. "We were glad to hear the arrangement had been formalized," Agnes said. "It was becoming a subject of some concern." "So I heard. A woman in an unmarried man's house, particularly given the circumstances of how you came to be here. People do talk." "People do," Mabel said. A slight pause. Agnes folded her hands on the table. "I don't mean to be unkind. I know it must have been a difficult journey, and Gideon Cross is a decent man. He deserves—" She stopped, and Mabel watched her choose her next words and recognized the pause as the one that comes before a thing is said that the speaker knows is a bit much to say. "He deserves a wife who can manage a frontier household. It's not an easy life. It requires a particular kind of constitution." Mabel poured the tea. She set the cup in front of Agnes with a steady hand. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "how long have you been in this territory?" Agnes blinked. 14 years. "And in those 14 years, how many winters have you put up stores for? How many root cellars have you managed? How many times have you had to stretch what you had because there wasn't more?" A beat. "Well, I grew up on a Kentucky hill farm with 4 people and not enough of anything," Mabel said. Her voice was even. She had learned over many years how to say hard things evenly. "I kept accounts before I could properly spell. I know how to make a garden work in bad soil. I know how to salt meat, and I know how to stretch a store of flour, and I know how to look at what a household has and figure out what it's missing." She picked up her cup. "I'm not worried about my constitution, Mrs. Whitmore." Agnes looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Well," and reached for her tea. They spent another 20 minutes in conversation that was not exactly comfortable, but was not exactly hostile either, the way conversations go when 2 people have taken each other's measure, and neither one has fully decided what to do with the information. When Agnes left, she said it had been very nice, and that she hoped to see them both at the next church gathering, and Mabel said she'd mention it to Gideon, and they parted on terms that were at least clear. Gideon came in from the paddock an hour later and found Mabel at the table with Agnes's pie and her account ledger open in front of her. "Was that Agnes Whitmore's wagon I saw leaving?" "It was." He pulled out a chair and sat down. Looked at the pie. "How'd it go?" "Fine." She made a note in the ledger. "She brought apple." He looked at the pie and back at her. "You all right?" "I told her I wasn't worried about my constitution." A very brief pause. "What'd she say to that?" "She drank her tea." He made the sound that she was beginning to recognize as his version of a laugh, the one that didn't quite make it all the way out. "Did you save me a piece of that pie?" "I saved you half." He got up and got a fork. October turned to November, and the desert cold came in differently than any cold Mabel had known. Not the wet gray chill of Kentucky winters, but something sharp and dry, with clear nights that went so black and full of stars it seemed almost implausible. She had never seen stars like that. She didn't say so to anyone, but some evenings when the work was done, she stood outside the back door of the house for a few minutes before going in and just looked up. The work didn't slow with the cold. It changed. Cattle needed different managing in the cold months. Fences needed constant checking for damage. The horses needed more feed and more attention. She learned by watching and by doing badly and then doing better, which was how she'd learned most things in her life. Dewey was her primary teacher in this, mostly because he was young enough to not feel threatened by her questions, and honest enough to say when he didn't know something. He showed her how to check a fence line, how to tell from a cow's behavior when something was wrong, how to handle a horse that didn't want to be handled. He was patient in the particular way of people who are themselves still learning and remember what it's like not to know. Hatch, she came to understand, taught differently. He didn't explain so much as he demonstrated, doing things slowly enough that you could watch and absorb if you were paying attention. If you asked him a direct question, he'd answer it. If you made a mistake, he'd correct it once, without judgment, and then he'd move on. He never praised her work directly, but one morning she overheard him telling Dewey that Mrs. Cross's irrigation schedule for the garden was smarter than what they'd been doing, and she held on to that. She also made mistakes. This needs to be said plainly because she was not, despite what some might later remember, a woman who stepped into this life effortlessly. She miscalculated a feed order, and they ran short for 2 weeks in November and had to make costly corrections. She burned 3 batches of preserves because she was trying to do too many things at once and misjudged the temperature. She made a decision about rotating the cattle in the east paddock without consulting Gideon, and it turned out to be wrong, and the correction cost them 2 days' work. That last one was the hardest. She came and told him directly because she was not built for pretending, and he stood in the barn with his arms folded, listening to her explain what she'd gotten wrong. And when she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "Why'd you rotate them that way?" "I thought the east grass was still good enough. I miscounted how much they'd already been through it." "Yeah." He looked at the paddock. "I've made that exact mistake. Lost a week over it 3 years back." He unfolded his arms and picked up the halter he'd been repairing. "Next time check with me first if you're not sure, not because I'll say no, just because 2 sets of eyes catch more." She waited for more. There wasn't more. She said, "That's it?" He looked at her. "What else were you expecting?" She didn't answer that, but she thought about it later, and what she thought was that she had been expecting the other kind, the kind where a mistake becomes a referendum, where what you did wrong becomes evidence of what you are. She had lived with that kind for 24 years, and she hadn't realized, until its absence, how much of her energy had been dedicated to bracing for it. She found the things he was bad at slowly, the way you find things in a room you're still learning. He was bad at rest. He had no understanding of stopping, not in the way of stubbornness, but in the way of a man who has spent so many years with too much to do that stillness itself had become foreign. She'd catch him on Sunday mornings, which should have been light, already out in the barn by 6, already finding something to fix or check or restock. She said once, "You know the fence on the south side will still be there after breakfast." And he looked at her with the expression of a man who genuinely hadn't considered the alternative. He was also bad at asking for help. Not the practical kind, Hussey. He could ask Hatch and Dewey for anything without difficulty. But the other kind. The kind where you need to say a thing is hard or a thing is worrying you. He carried that kind of thing alone, and he carried it badly, which meant that sometimes a small frustration became a large silence, became 3 days of him operating at half remove while he worked through something he hadn't told anyone about. She learned to watch for the signs, a particular tightness around the jaw. The way he'd go quiet at supper, not in the easy silence she'd gotten used to, but in a different quality of quiet, one that had weight to it. When she saw it, she didn't push. She'd ask once, not what's wrong, but something practical, something adjacent, like, "How's the east herd looking?" Or Dewey said the south fence took some weather. And sometimes he'd answer practically and gradually, the rest of it would come out sideways, which seemed to be the only direction he knew how to let things out. This is how she found out, in the 3rd week of November, that there was a problem with the water rights. He came in late from a ride to the county seat in Maricopa, and he sat down at the table and didn't eat the supper she'd kept warm, and she looked at him from across the room and said, "What happened?" "Ran into Dale Hurst at the county office." She had not met Dale Hurst, but she'd heard the name. A larger rancher to the northwest, the kind of man who had been in a territory long enough to believe that length of residence was the same as entitlement. "And?" Gideon pressed his hands flat on the table. "He's filing a claim on the Northern Creek, says it comes off land he has prior rights to, and the water that comes through my north pasture is downstream of his. He wants a usage agreement that would put him in control of flow." Mabel sat down. She knew enough by now to know what that meant. The North Creek fed 2 of the 5 pastures. Without reliable access to it in the dry months, the herd would be in trouble. Can he do that? He's got a lawyer in Tucson working on it. He looked at the table. I've got a property record from '78 that establishes the creek as shared access, but Hurst is arguing the original survey was wrong. Is he right? No. The word was flat and certain. He's not right. But being not right hasn't stopped men like Dale Hurst before. She was quiet a moment. What does the county record show? He looked at her. What? The county survey records. From the original filing on this land. What do they show exactly? Not what you remember. What does the document say about the creek's designation? He stared at her for a moment. I'd have to pull the deed records. Then we should pull them. Mabel. You have a record from 78. If there's a survey attached to that deed, it'll show the creek's position relative to your property line. If Hurst is claiming the original survey was wrong, the original survey is what you need. She put her hands on the table. Do you have copies here, or are they at the county office? He looked at her with the expression she was getting to know, the one that meant he was recalculating again. I've got copies in the desk. Then after supper, we look at them. He looked at the plate she'd put in front of him. He hadn't touched it. He picked up a fork. You sound like you've done this before, he said. I kept my father's farm accounts, lease records, tax filings, everything. When a neighbor tried to claim our east field was over the property line, we found the original county plat map, and that was the end of it. She watched him eat. Land disputes aren't won by being right. They're won by having better paper than the other man. Something shifted in his face. Not quite relief, not yet, but the quality of the weight he was carrying changed. We'll look at the records tonight, he said. Yes, she said. Eat first. The deed records were a mess, not because he was careless, but because nobody had ever put them in order. Documents from different years filed together without logic, some loose, some folded into envelopes, at least one stuck to another with something that had long since dried. She sat at the table with him for 2 hours while he pulled things, and she organized them chronologically and by type. And by the end of it, they had something that looked like a clear chain. The 1878 deed was the key one. It had an attached survey diagram, rough, hand-drawn, but clear, showing the northern creek running along the boundary of the cross property with a notation that marked it as shared riparian access, both parties. Both parties being, in 1878, Gideon's predecessor in title and a homesteader named Allin, who no longer held any land in the county. Hurst bought Allin's original parcel in 81, Gideon said, looking at the diagram. So he bought the land. He didn't buy the designation. She pointed to the notation. This creek was established as shared before he ever came into it. His claim that the original survey was wrong would have to prove this document is wrong, which means he'd need to produce a contradicting survey from before 1878. Gideon was quiet. Does he have one? She asked. I don't know. That's what the lawyer in Tucson is for, to find one or manufacture one. She sat back. You need to talk to someone at the county land office before Hurst's lawyer does anything more. Get a certified copy of this survey with the official seal. Make it harder to challenge. He looked at the document, then at her. How do you know this? I told you, land disputes. My father was not a good man, but he knew how to fight for what was his, and I learned by watching him do it. She paused. And I read. I had a lot of time alone in that house, and not much else to do with it. He nodded slowly. I'll go to Maricopa next week. Go Thursday, before the end of the month when Hurst's lawyer might file something. He folded the survey document carefully. She watched him do it and thought that there was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not gratitude exactly, because gratitude has a quality of surprise to it, and this looked more like recognition, like a man who has been carrying something heavy and has just understood that it doesn't have to be carried alone. He put the document back in the envelope and said, Thank you. She said, You'd have gotten there. He looked at her. Not as fast. She didn't argue with that. It was probably true. Eek. December came, and with it the hardest adjustment she'd faced since arriving. Not the cold, not the work, not the loneliness of a vast land where the nearest neighbor was 6 miles away. It was something smaller and harder to name. It was the particular ache of a woman who has gotten exactly what she asked for and isn't sure she deserves to keep it. She knew the shape of this feeling. She had felt it before at the edges, when something good came near enough to touch. A kind teacher in school who praised her arithmetic, a neighbor woman who had given her a coat one winter without making her feel small for needing it. The feeling that if she looked at the good thing too directly, it would see her seeing it and know it had made a mistake. She didn't say this to Gideon. She wouldn't have known how. But one evening in early December, she was sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the account ledger open in front of her and not reading it. And he came in from checking the horses and poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter and looked at her. "You're not writing anything," he said. "I'm thinking." "About what?" She looked at the ledger. She said, "About whether I'm actually useful here or whether I've just convinced myself I am." A pause. He drank his coffee. "Where'd that come from?" "It's something I think about." "Why?" She closed the ledger. "Because I spent a long time being told that I was a burden, that I took up too much space and cost too much to feed, and didn't do enough to earn what little I had." She said it flatly, the way you say things when you've turned them over so many times the sharp edges have worn down to something manageable. It doesn't go away just because you're somewhere different. The voice stays. He was quiet for a moment. She didn't look at him. Then he said, "You reorganized a root cellar that I hadn't been able to get to in 2 years. You found the survey document that'll win the water rights case. You've been running this kitchen and tracking our stores and working that garden since October, and nothing's been short." He set his cup down. "And Hatch told me yesterday that the way you handled the east herd rotation, the correction you made after the mistake, was cleaner than what he'd seen me do." She looked up. "He doesn't say things like that," Gideon said. "Hatch doesn't say anything he doesn't mean." She looked at him for a moment, then she looked back at the table. "The voice is still there," she said. "I know." He picked up his cup again. "But it's wrong." He went to bed. She sat at the table for a while longer in the lamplight, not writing in the ledger, just sitting, and she thought about a voice that had lived in her head for 24 years, that spoke in her father's cadence and her brother's laughter, and the particular register of public ridicule. And she thought about the slow, boring daily work of not listening to it. It was not a dramatic thing. That was the part she hadn't understood before she came here. That the real work of becoming a person who knew their own worth was not one big moment, but 10,000 small ones. A root cellar, a survey document, a correction made and accepted without theater. Hatch, who didn't say things he didn't mean, saying the right thing to the right person. She put out the lamp and went to bed. On the 23rd of December, Dewey got hurt. He was trying to repair a section of fence in the northwest corner of the property, the one that had been taking weather damage since November, and the post gave way wrong and caught him across the forearm. He came back to the main yard holding the arm against his chest and not saying much, which told her it was worse than he was letting on, because Dewey's natural state was talking. She sat him down in the kitchen and cut away his sleeve and looked at it. A bad gash, deep, still bleeding freely. Not broken as far as she could tell. He could move the fingers, though it cost him. But the wound needed cleaning and closing, and someone needed to be calm about it. Gideon wasn't there. He'd ridden to the south boundary with Hatch that morning. "It's not bad," Dewey said, which it absolutely was. "It's not good either," she said. She got the clean cloth from the shelf and poured water and didn't let herself think too hard about the smell of it because she'd done this before. Not on a ranch, but in a Kentucky farmhouse where men came home from rough work or rougher recreation, and someone had to put them back together. "I'm sorry," he said. I know this isn't—" "Dewey," she said. "Stop talking." He stopped talking. She cleaned the wound. He made a sound once, controlled. The sound of a young man trying hard not to make a sound. And she worked through it steadily. When it was as clean as she could get it, she closed it with strips of cloth pulled tight and tied. Not proper stitches because she didn't have the implements and wasn't confident in the technique, but firm enough to hold. "Keep it up," she told him. "Don't use that arm for anything today. The fence can wait 2 days." She looked at him. "You understand me?" He looked at her with the expression of a young man who has just realized something has shifted and isn't sure how to categorize it. "Yes, ma'am," he said, which was the first time he'd said ma'am to her. She made him tea. She didn't have much in the way of remedies, but she had willow bark she'd bought at the general store in November because she'd learned early that pain comes eventually to everyone in a working household, and it's better to be prepared. When Gideon and Hatch came back in the afternoon and saw Dewey at the table with his arm wrapped in a cup of tea, Gideon came directly inside and looked at the wrapping and looked at Mabel. "What happened?" She told him. He went and looked at the wound more closely. Dewey endured this with an expression of practiced suffering. And then he looked at the wrapping again. "Nice work," he said. "It needs to be looked at by someone who knows what they're doing if it doesn't start closing in a day or two," she said. "I don't want it to sour." "There's a doctor in Red Mesa. I'll take him in if it needs it." Hatch, from the doorway, looked at the wrapped arm and then at Mabel and then back at the arm with the expression of a man who is revising an estimate. Dewey said, "She made me drink willow bark tea." "Good," said Hatch and walked back outside. Christmas came and went without much ceremony. She made a meal that was better than the usual, a beef roast and cornbread and the last of the apple preserve she'd put up in October. And Dewey came and Hatch came, and they ate together at the long table and nobody made speeches because none of them were people who made speeches. But there was something in it, the warmth of the stove, the sound of people at a table eating food someone had made carefully. Dewey trying unsuccessfully to cut his meat with one hand and finally letting Hatch do it for him without comment. After she washed the dishes and Gideon dried them, which he hadn't done before, and they worked in the quiet of it side by side. "Good meal," he said. "Thank you." He dried a plate. "You didn't have to do all that." "I wanted to." She handed him the next plate. "I haven't had a Christmas meal to make in a long time. My mother used to—" She stopped, then went on. "She used to make cornbread from scratch. Not from a kit, from scratch. I never learned how until I was 17 and she was already sick. She only showed me once." He looked at her. "The cornbread tonight." "Yes." He was quiet. Then, "It was good cornbread." She handed him the last dish. "I know." They put out the lamps and she went to her room and she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark Arizona night and she thought, this is what a home feels like. Not the perfect version, not the kind they write about, the real kind. With willow bark tea and fence posts and survey documents and a man who dries dishes without being asked and doesn't say anything more than what is needed. The kind that takes a long time to believe in because you've been shown so many reasons not to. She lay down on the bed that was hers, in the room that was hers, in the house that was beginning, slowly and without drama, to feel like hers too. Outside the window, the stars were enormous over the desert, the way they always were. She was still there in the morning. January came in hard. Not the wet cold of Kentucky that she knew in her bones. This was something drier and more honest about itself, a cold that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. The desert at night dropped to temperatures that surprised her every time, and the mornings had a particular quality of silence that she'd come to recognize as the land holding its breath before the sun came up far enough to matter. She had been Mrs. Cross for 3 months. The name still surprised her sometimes. Not unpleasantly. Just the way any true thing surprises you when you're still in the process of believing it. The water rights case had moved to the next stage. Gideon had gone to Maricopa in late November as she'd told him to, gotten the certified copy of the survey with the county seal, and the land office clerk, a methodical woman named Mrs. Paulson, who apparently had no patience for anyone who tried to file contradicting claims without proper documentation, had flagged Hearst's attorney's inquiry as pending resolution. It wasn't over. These things were never over quickly. But the ground had shifted and Hearst's lawyer had stopped making noise for the moment, which Gideon said was either a good sign or the sign of someone regrouping. She had learned by now that good news on the frontier was rarely clean. It just meant you'd bought yourself more time before the next problem. Dewey's arm healed. Not without difficulty. There were 4 days in early January when it looked like it might be going bad, red and hot at the edges, and she'd made Gideon take him to Dr. Kane in Red Mesa, who cleaned it properly and said the original closing had been sound, and it just needed time. Dewey came back from that visit with the particular expression of a young man who has been told by a doctor that someone else did the right thing, and he looked at Mabel with something in his eyes that she recognized after a moment as simple, uncomplicated gratitude. She didn't know what to do with it. She had not received much gratitude in her life that wasn't conditional. "You don't have to thank me," she told him. "I know," he said. "I'm doing it anyway." She went back to what she was doing. The trouble with Dale Hearst didn't stay in the land office. She understood that the moment she met him. He came to the ranch on a Saturday in the second week of January, uninvited, which she suspected was deliberate, the kind of move designed to catch people unprepared. She was in the garden doing winter maintenance on the beds, turning soil and pulling dead root systems, when she heard the wagon coming up the drive. She stood and watched it arrive. 2 horses, a good wagon, not a working man's rig. The driver was a ranch hand she didn't know. The man who climbed down from the bench was somewhere in his late 40s, heavy through the chest and shoulders, with a carefully trimmed beard and the clothes of a man who has money and wants you to know it without being obvious about it. He looked at her standing in the garden in her work clothes with soil on her hands, and he did the thing, the assessment, the calculation. But it was different from Agnes Whitmore's. Agnes Whitmore had been measuring whether Mabel was an appropriate woman. Dale Hurst was measuring whether she was a problem. "Is Cross around?" he said. Didn't introduce himself, didn't tip his hat. "He's in the south barn," she said. She didn't move from where she was standing. He looked at her for another moment, and she looked back at him, and then he walked toward the barn. Gideon came out before Hurst got there. He must have heard the wagon from inside. He came around the side of the barn and stopped when he saw who it was. And something in the way he stopped told Mabel everything she needed to know about what Gideon thought of Dale Hurst. She went to the porch and did not go inside. She could hear the conversation from there. She wasn't sure if Gideon knew she could hear it, and she didn't think it mattered either way. "Hurst," Gideon said. Not a greeting, just the name. "Cross." Hurst stopped a few feet from him. He had a way of standing that took up space deliberately, the posture of a man who has spent a long time being the largest presence in any room he entered. "I wanted to have a conversation before this goes any further. Your lawyer's already taken it further. That's what lawyers do. I'm talking about between the 2 of us." Hurst glanced toward the house, toward where Mabel stood on the porch. Back to Gideon. "The Northern Creek is a problem. You know it, and I know it. My land runs above yours, and the flow comes from my elevation. What the 78 document says doesn't change the practical reality." "The practical reality," Gideon said, "is that the county survey establishes shared access. That's the legal reality, too. Legal realities can be expensive to defend." Hurst said it pleasantly, the kind of pleasant that is actually a threat delivered in a comfortable coat. "I'm not here to make this ugly. I'm here to offer you a usage agreement that gives you all the access you need and settles this without a fight." "What kind of usage agreement?" "A formal arrangement where you compensate me annually for the downstream flow. Reasonable figure. Nothing that would," he glanced at the house again, "strain what you've got here." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "So you want me to pay you for water that the county says I already have the right to? I want to avoid a legal fight that neither of us benefits from." "You'd benefit from it. Your lawyer's making sure of that." Hurst's pleasant expression didn't change. "Think about it. Talk it over. You've got a new wife, a new setup here. These aren't good circumstances for a lengthy legal dispute." He turned to go and then half turned back. "Nice to see Cross Ranch looking a bit more managed than it has been. You've made some improvements." He said it looking not at Gideon but at Mabel on the porch. Gideon said nothing. Mabel said nothing. Hurst got back in his wagon and his hand turned it around and they drove out. After the wagon was gone, Gideon stood in the yard for a moment without moving. Then he came toward the house. Mabel went inside and put the kettle on. He came in and sat down. He was holding something in carefully. She could see it in the set of his jaw. "That was Dale Hurst," he said. "I gathered. He wants annual payment for the creek access." "I heard." She poured water. "He wants you to feel like a fight is more costly than capitulation." "It might be." "It might be," she agreed. "How much is the creek worth to you?" He looked at her. "In practical terms," she said, "if you lost access to the North Creek in a dry summer, what does that cost you? How many head? How many acres of pasture?" He thought for a moment. "Dry summer like we had 3 years back, I'd lose maybe 40 head, maybe more. And 2 of the 5 pastures go to poor grass by July without that water. So losing the creek costs you 40 cattle minimum in a bad year." She set the cup down. "What did Hurst's annual figure sound like to you? Ball figure?" He didn't name one, but he said reasonable. Men who call their own figures reasonable never mean it. She sat down across from him. "What would it take to fight it properly?" "A lawyer, time, money for both." "Do you have it?" "I have some. Not a lot." She folded her hands on the table. Then we need to know exactly how much the fight would cost before we decide anything. Not Hearst's estimate, our own. She paused. Is there a lawyer in Maricopa worth using? Not one Hearst already has in his pocket. Well, Gideon looked at the table, then at her. There's a man named Reardon. He did good work for a neighbor of mine in a grazing dispute a few years back. Write to him this week. Get a real estimate. Then we decide. He was quiet for a moment. You're sure? I'm sure we shouldn't let Dale Hearst tell us what our options are. She picked up her cup. That's all I'm sure of right now. The rest we figure out. Tub. The letter to Reardon went out Tuesday. The response came back in 10 days, detailed, clear-eyed, with a fee structure that was not cheap, and a frank assessment that the 1878 survey document was strong but not unassailable, and that Hearst's attorney was known to the county courts and not incompetent. Gideon read it twice and handed it to Mabel, who read it once and set it on the table between them. He's right about the document, she said. It's strong, but Hearst could challenge the original surveyor's methodology and drag it out, which costs us time and money we're using up while he runs down the clock. Yes. She thought for a moment. Is there anyone else who has a stake in the Northern Creek? Other properties that share downstream access? Gideon frowned. The Delacroix homestead. They're northeast of us. They don't have creek access directly, but they've been using a tributary that feeds off the main branch. If Hearst controls the main branch, he controls the tributary too. Gideon went very still. I hadn't thought of that. If the Delacroix family has the same problem we have, Reardon has 2 clients instead of 1, shared legal cost, and 2 property holders challenging the same claim looks different to a county court than one. He looked at her for a long moment. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about it since Hearst came. She was looking at the letter, not at him. He expected you to feel alone in this. That's why he came here instead of writing. Men like Hearst manage by making the person across from them feel like they've already lost. And if Delacroix doesn't want to get involved, then we're no worse off than we are right now. She looked up. Will you ride out to their place? I'll go Thursday. She nodded and picked up the letter and read the fee structure section again. I can free up $40 from the household accounts without touching the operating reserve. It won't cover the full retainer, but it's a start. Mabel, it's my money too. She said it evenly, not as an argument, as a fact. This ranch is mine as much as it's yours. The creek matters to what we're building here. That's not a separate calculation. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had seen on his face before. In smaller moments. The recalculating one. The one that meant he was revising something he'd assumed. All right, he said. Good. She folded the letter. Eat something. You haven't eaten since morning. The Delacroix property was a 4-hour ride northeast, and Gideon came back from it on a Friday evening with a look on his face that she'd learned to read as cautiously good. They're interested, he said, at the supper table. Remy Delacroix knew about the filing, but he thought it only affected us. When I explained the tributary situation, Gideon paused. He's a careful man, doesn't move fast, but he's going to talk to his wife and write to me by end of month. What's he like? Honest, stubborn, not afraid of a fight. He ate for a moment. He asked about you, actually. She looked up. Why? Said he'd heard we'd gotten married. Said his wife had heard from someone, probably Agnes Whitmore's network, that you'd come from back east and were managing the ranch accounts. He looked at her. He said, and I'm giving you his exact words, is she as sharp as they say, or is that just talk? Mabel was quiet for a moment. What did you tell him? I told him sharper. She looked back at her plate. She felt something she couldn't quite describe. Not pride exactly, which she'd always been suspicious of. Something quieter. The particular feeling of being seen accurately. If Delacroix comes in, she said, we should have all the documentation together before we meet with Reardon. Clean, organized, referenced, not a pile of papers, a real record. That's your territory, he said. I know. I'll start on it next week. He nodded. They ate. Outside, the January wind moved across the desert with a low, persistent sound that she had stopped finding lonely and started finding simply real. February brought something she hadn't accounted for. She noticed it first as a kind of persistent tiredness that was different from the tiredness of hard work, which she knew well and had made a kind of peace with. This was something underneath that, a heaviness that didn't lift after sleep, that made the smell of coffee in the mornings do something unpleasant to her stomach. She told herself it was the cold. She told herself it was the accumulated stress of the water rights situation and the long winter and the newness of everything. She told herself a lot of things for about 2 weeks before the evidence became impossible to argue with. She sat in her room on a February morning with the pale early light coming through the window, and she thought about what this meant with the same practical focus she brought to everything. Not the feeling of it yet, just the facts. Facts she could work with. She was 24 years old, she was married, she was on a working cattle ranch in the Arizona Territory in 1884. She had no mother to ask, no close woman friend nearby, no one she trusted enough to... She stopped that thought. She had Gideon. That was who she had, and 6 months ago that sentence would have been a frightening one, and now it was simply true. She had Gideon, and she would tell him when she was ready, and they would figure it out the way they figured everything out, which was to say imperfectly and together. She gave herself one more day. She spent it finishing the documentation package for Reardon, organized by date, cross-referenced by parcel number, with a summary page she'd written that laid out the legal chain of access in plain language. She was proud of it. She let herself be proud of it. Then she cooked supper and they ate, and Dewey went back to the bunkhouse and Hatch went with him, and she and Gideon were at the table with the lamp and the remains of the meal between them. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked up from his coffee. She told him. He was very still for a moment, not the bad kind of still, the kind that means a person is taking something in with their whole body and not just their mind. "You're certain," he said. "Yes." He put down the coffee cup. He looked at the lamp. Then he looked at her. How are you feeling?" "Tired. Sick in the mornings mostly. It passes by midday." He nodded slowly. She watched him process it. The lines of his face were not arranged in any way she'd seen before, some combination of things she couldn't fully read. "Say what you're thinking," she said. She had learned this was necessary with him. Left to himself, he would think for 3 days and come out with a conclusion, and she would have spent those 3 days guessing at the process. "I'm thinking," he started, stopped, pressed his hand flat on the table. "I'm thinking I'm glad, and I'm thinking I'm scared, both at once." He looked at her. Does that help?" "It helps," she said, "because that's exactly what I'm thinking too." Something in the room changed, not dramatically. Nothing in their life together was dramatic by conventional measure. But the quality of the air between them shifted in the way it does when two people have both admitted to the same fear at the same moment and found it doesn't crush them. He said, "We should get you to Dr. Kane. In the spring. It's too cold to make that trip unnecessarily right now. I know enough to take care of myself for now." He looked like he wanted to argue with this, and then thought better of it, which she recognized as a kind of growing wisdom on his part. "What do you need? What can I do differently?" "The heavy water buckets, the ones by the north paddock. Done. And don't tell Dewey yet. He'll make it into something." The corner of his mouth moved. "He will." She began clearing the plates. He stood up and took some from her, which he'd been doing since Christmas. She thought about how that had started. Small, unremarked, the way most real things start. She thought about the survey documents and the letter to Reardon and the $40 from the household accounts. She thought about a year ago when she had been writing a letter at 2 a.m. to a stranger because anywhere had to be better. She handed him a plate and he dried it and set it on the shelf. "Gideon," she said. "For what it's worth. I'm glad too. More than scared, I think. Today, anyway." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Me too. Today, anyway." Remy Delacroix sent his letter at the end of February. He was in. He'd spoken to his wife, Celeste, and they were prepared to share the legal cost and add their documentation to the challenge. Reardon would have 2 clients, 2 properties, 2 sets of records all pointing at the same problem with Dale Hurst's claim. The day that letter arrived, Gideon read it at the kitchen table and handed it to Mabel, and she read it and set it down, and they looked at each other across the table. "We should write to Reardon tomorrow," she said. "First thing." She put the letter with the documentation package. March was the month the town decided it had an opinion about Mabel Cross. She had been aware, at a low level, that Red Mesa watched them. Small towns watch things. It was the natural condition of a community with limited entertainment and a high density of people who had known each other too long. She had expected it, and she had not expected to care about it. And she found, to her own surprise, that some days she cared more than she wanted to. It was the particular kind of caring that comes not from wanting approval, but from being tired of being a curiosity. She had been a curiosity her whole life, too big, too plain, too quick to say what she thought. And the specific flavor of it here was different from Harlan County, but it was recognizable. She saw it in the way conversations paused when she came into the general store, in the way women at the post office looked at her and then at each other, in the questions people asked Gideon that were really questions about her, phrased sideways so they didn't have to ask directly. She mentioned none of this to Gideon. He would have wanted to do something about it, and there was nothing to do. You could not argue with the town's curiosity, you just had to outlast it. What she hadn't expected was Celeste Delacroix. Celeste came with Remy when he and Gideon rode out to discuss the Reardon arrangement in March, and she was a small, compact French-Canadian woman, somewhere in her mid-30s, who had the directness of someone raised in a cold climate with no patience for indirection. She came into the kitchen, looked around, looked at Mabel, and said, "So you're the one who figured out the tributary situation." "I raised the question," Mabel said. "Your husband figured out it applied. Remy said it was your question that mattered." Celeste sat down without being asked. "We've been in this territory 4 years. In 4 years, nobody thought to ask that question. Not the county office, not Hearst's lawyer, not any of the neighbors." She looked at Mabel steadily. "How did you know to ask it?" "I didn't know. I was thinking about who else had standing to challenge the claim." Mabel put the kettle on. "If you can make something someone else's problem too, it stops being only yours." Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, that's exactly right." She said it the way people say things when they've known something intuitively for years and just heard it named clearly for the first time. They had coffee and talked while the men discussed the legal arrangement in the front room. Talked practically, the way women on the frontier talked when there wasn't time for anything else, about stores and seasons and the particular challenges of maintaining any kind of system in a place that was designed to resist systems. Celeste had 3 children. She talked about them plainly, without sentimentality, with the clarity of a woman who loves her children but is not confused about how difficult they are. When they were leaving, Celeste stopped at the door and looked at Mabel. "I heard about you before today," she said, "from town. The things people say." Mabel held her gaze. "I expect so. They say you're—" Celeste paused, and Mabel waited for the thing she'd been waiting for, the specific cruelty dressed as observation that she'd been receiving her whole life. And instead Celeste said, "They say you're capable and plain-spoken and probably too smart for most of the conversations you have to sit through." She said it matter-of-factly, like a weather report. "I thought you should know that some of what they say is accurate." Mabel looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Come visit when the weather's better. It's a long ride, but worth it. I could use someone worth talking to." She got in the wagon. Mabel stood on the porch and watched them go, and she felt something she could only identify by its absence. The absence of the familiar weight of being assessed and found wanting. Celeste Delacroix had assessed her and found her worth a 4-hour ride. That was not nothing. The legal challenge to Hearst's water claim was formally filed with the county in the last week of March. Reardon's documentation was tight. The 1878 survey, the chain of title, the tributary analysis, and a secondary argument about established use that Mabel had suggested, and that Reardon had turned into proper legal language. 2 property holders, 2 sets of records, 1 clear claim. Hearst's attorney requested a delay, which Reardon had told them to expect. The county granted 60 days. It would drag into summer at least. "He's waiting us out," Gideon said, the night the delay came through. "He can wait." She was at the kitchen table with the account ledger because the legal costs had made the winter accounts tighter than she liked, and she was recalculating the spring budget. "We're not going anywhere." He looked at her from across the table. She was 4 months along by then, showing enough that it was no longer something she could keep only between them. She had told Dewey 2 weeks ago, and he had gone through approximately 6 emotions in 3 seconds, landing finally on a grin that had taken up his whole face. Hatch had been told the same day and had said, "Good," with his characteristic economy, and then had quietly reorganized the water schedule so that the morning's heaviest carrying fell to him and Dewey without it ever being mentioned. Small things. She kept collecting them. "The spring cattle work starts in 2 weeks, Gideon said. "I want to talk about what you can and can't do. What I can and can't do is not your decision." "No," he said. "But it's a conversation I'd like to have." She looked up from the ledger. He was sitting across from her with his hands around his coffee cup and the look he had when he was being careful with something. Not timid, not uncertain, just careful in the way of a man who has made enough mistakes to know where he can't afford to make another. She put her pen down. "All right, talk." "The heavy cattle work, the roping, the branding runs, anything that involves a horse moving fast or a fall risk. I want Hatch or Dewey to cover it. Not you." "Agreed." He blinked. "Just like that?" "I'm not foolish, Gideon. I know what's sensible." She picked up her pen. "I'll take the records work, the supply management, the cooking schedule. I can still ride short distances at a walk. I'm not an invalid." "I know that." "Then we agree." She made a notation in the ledger. "Are you going to be strange about this all the way through?" "Probably," he said. "I appreciate the honesty." "You always do." She almost smiled. She went back to the ledger. He went back to his coffee. Outside, the March wind was doing something to the shutters on the south side of the house. A loose rattling that she'd been meaning to mention for a week, and she wrote south shutters at the bottom of her maintenance list without looking up. She was managing a household and a water rights dispute, and a pregnancy and a spring cattle operation, and a tentative new friendship with a French-Canadian woman who was worth the conversation. She was doing all of it imperfectly, and without any of the things she'd been told a woman like her would never have. The voice that spoke in her father's cadence was still there. Some mornings, it was louder. But it was competing now with other voices: Hatch's sparse approval, Dewey's unguarded affection, Celeste's frank assessment, and underneath all of them the quiet daily fact of Gideon Cross at a kitchen table drying dishes without being asked, drinking coffee before dawn, riding 4 hours to the county seat with her survey document in his coat pocket, saying, "I'm scared and I'm glad," at the same moment she was. She turned to the next page of the ledger. There was spring work to plan and accounts to balance and a water fight to win, and she was not done. Spring came to the Arizona territory the way it always did. Not gently, not with the soft green creep that she remembered from Kentucky, but suddenly, as though the land had simply decided it was done with cold and switched without transition to something else entirely. The desert bloomed in ways she hadn't expected. Colors appeared in the scrub that she hadn't known were waiting there. The air changed its character between 1 week and the next, and by April, the mornings were warm enough that she left the kitchen door open while she made breakfast and stood for a moment in the doorway listening to the birds she still couldn't name. She was 5 months along, and she had made a practical peace with her body's new terms. The morning sickness had mostly passed. The tiredness had settled into something she could manage, different from what it had been in February. Less like being pulled under and more like carrying extra weight, which she understood. She had always been a woman who carried extra weight. She knew how to compensate. The spring cattle work was the most intensive labor the ranch ran all year, and she watched it from the position she'd agreed to. Records, supply, the kitchen, the short ride she took in the early mornings before the heat built, walking her horse along the fence lines at a pace that was more inventory than riding. She tracked the calf count as Dewey and Hatch and Gideon brought them in for branding, logged each animal against the herd record she'd built over the winter, cross-referenced the losses from the 6th season Gideon had mentioned when she first arrived, and which she'd been reconstructing from memory and old receipts ever since. "You've been rebuilding the loss records," Gideon said one evening, looking over her shoulder at the ledger. He hadn't asked her to do it. He hadn't known she was doing it. "You said you'd lost cattle to the sickness before I arrived. I wanted to know what the actual numbers were, for the insurance valuation and for the county records if the water case goes to arbitration." He was quiet for a moment, reading. "This is thorough." "It took a while. Your receipt filing from 81 and 82 was bad. I was going to say organic. He made the sound that was his laugh. It was bad. It was bad, she agreed. I fixed it. He straightened up. The water case goes to the county hearing in June. Reardon sent word yesterday. She looked up. What kind of hearing? A formal one. Both sides present documentation and argument in front of the county commissioner. Reardon says it's not a court of law, but it carries weight. If we win here, Hearst's lawyer would have to go to the territorial court to overturn it, which is expensive enough that he might not bother. And if we lose here? Same problem, other direction. She closed the ledger. Does Reardon want the loss records? He didn't ask for them. He should have them anyway. If we can show that restricted water access in dry years directly correlates to herd losses, that's an economic argument on top of the legal one. She opened the ledger again. I'll write a summary. He can decide if he wants to use it. Gideon looked at her for a moment. You know you're doing his job. I know. But he's doing it in Maricopa, and I'm doing it here, and I know this land and this herd better than he does. She picked up her pen. Write to him and tell him a summary is coming. He wrote the letter. She wrote the summary. Chet. The branding work ran through the last 2 weeks of April and into May, long days that started before sunrise and ended after dark. And she ran the household around it with the kind of efficiency that she'd learned was the only way anything got done on a working ranch. Meals at specific times because men who work that hard stopped functioning without regular food. Supplies tracked and restocked before they ran out because running out mid-season cost twice as much to fix as preventing the shortage. Water for the horses and the men, the kitchen and the garden, all of it balanced against what the well in the North Creek could reliably provide. There was a week in late April when the well pump gave them trouble. A mechanical failure that Hatch diagnosed and that required a part from the general store in Red Mesa, which meant 3 days of hauling water by hand from the creek while they waited. 3 days of extra trips, extra weight, extra time. She reorganized the schedule, reduced the water usage for cooking where she could without compromising the food, and managed the garden through it with buckets she carried herself until Dewey caught her doing it and took them from her with an expression on his face that she'd come to identify as his version of firm. I'm pregnant, she said, not helpless. I know that, he said. Give me the bucket. She gave him the bucket. The part came and Hatch fixed the pump with the wordless competence of a man who has repaired everything at least once, and life went back to its regular shape. She thanked him and he said it was fine and went back to what he was doing. She had learned to accept this from Hatch, not the absence of warmth, but its translation into something practical and action-based, which she was coming to believe was a more reliable form of it than the kind that expressed itself in words. The June hearing was on a Thursday, which meant Gideon and Remy Delacroix rode to Maricopa together on Wednesday and came back Friday evening. Mabel stayed at the ranch, which she had agreed to but had not fully made peace with, and she spent the 2 days doing the work that needed doing and not spending too much time in her head about what was happening 60 miles away. Celeste sent a rider with a note on Thursday afternoon. It said only, Remy says Reardon was sharp. We'll know by tomorrow. See? Mabel read it and went back to the kitchen and made supper and kept the lamp on later than usual on Thursday night, sitting at the table with a book she was not reading. They came back Friday evening, dusty from the road, horses tired. She saw them coming from the kitchen window and she went to the porch. Gideon's face when he climbed down from his horse told her before he said a word. Not elated. She'd learned by now that he didn't do elation. It wasn't in his register. But the particular quality of tension he'd been carrying since January was gone from his jaw. Reardon prevailed, he said. She let out a breath. On all points? On the core claim, the 1878 designation stands. Shared riparian access, both parties, no compensation owed. He tied the horse. Hearst's attorney argued the original survey was inaccurate, but Reardon had pulled the original surveyor's field notes from the territorial archive. He looked at her. Which he got because you mentioned in your summary that the field notes might exist, and he went looking. She stood very still. Did it matter? The commissioner said the field notes corroborated the survey at every point. It closed the methodology argument completely. He came up to the porch. He was standing close enough that she could see the road dust on his face and the tiredness behind his eyes, and something else that she took a moment to identify as relief so large it looked almost like grief. Hearst can still take it to territorial court, but Reardon said he didn't think he would. Too expensive for an argument. He's already lost once. Remy Delacroix called out from behind him. Mrs. Cross, your summary document was cited by name in the commissioner's notes. By name. She looked at Remy, then back at Gideon. Good, she said. Come inside, both of you. There's food. They ate at the long table, all of them, Gideon and Remy and Hatch and Dewey, who already knew from Gideon's face what had happened and was barely containing himself. She had made a proper meal, not knowing when they'd return, but knowing they'd be hungry, and she sat at the table and ate with them and listened to Remy describe the hearing in his careful way, while Dewey asked questions faster than they could be answered, and Hatch sat at the end of the table and ate steadily and said almost nothing. When Remy left for the long ride home, Gideon walked him out and came back in, and they were alone in the kitchen. She was at the basin, washing dishes she didn't really need to be washing. He came and stood beside her, and she could feel him finding the words for something. That summary, he said. The field notes. It was a reasonable suggestion. He didn't have to act on it. He acted on it because you were right. He paused. That case could have gone the other way. If Hearst's methodology argument had stood, it didn't. No. He was quiet for a moment. I've been on this land for 11 years. Nobody told me to look for the field notes. I wouldn't have thought to. She handed him a cup to dry. You would have eventually. Maybe. He dried it. You've been here 9 months. She handed him another. They worked through the rest in silence, and when they were done, she dried her hands and turned around, and he was standing with his back against the counter, looking at her with an expression that she didn't try to read too precisely, because some things didn't need reading, they just needed acknowledging. We won, she said. We won, he said. That was enough. Summer came in behind the legal victory with all the indifference of a season that doesn't know or care what has happened in a county commissioner's office. The Arizona July heat was something she had read about and heard described and still found. Every year she would live through it, to be something that description couldn't fully prepare you for. It sat on the land with physical weight. It turned the air above the hard ground into something visible, shimmering and strange. The cattle moved slowly and needed more water, which the North Creek now provided without dispute. And the days stretched from before dawn to well after dark in the particular relentlessness of summer ranch work. She was 7 months along through the worst of it, and she managed because there was no other option and because she had never been able to convince herself that circumstances were a good reason to stop working. She moved more slowly. She rested in the middle of the day, which she had never done before in her life, and which she did now with her jaw set, because Gideon had asked her to and because she was not so stubborn that she couldn't recognize good sense when it was offered to her. Celeste came twice in July, the 4-hour ride that she'd said was worth it, and they sat on the porch in the relative cool of early morning and talked about the things that women talk about when they trust each other, which is to say, everything. The baby, the heat, the ranch, the men in their lives who were competent in most areas and completely lost in others. Celeste talked about her oldest child, a girl of 9 who was already more capable than most adults Celeste knew, and who was also, she said, an absolute menace in the way of very intelligent children who know it. Mabel laughed at this, genuine laughter, the kind she hadn't had easy access to for most of her life. What did the women in town say? Celeste asked, once. When it became obvious. Mabel considered. Agnes Whitmore came by in June with a jar of preserved peaches and told me I was looking well. And? That's the whole story. She said I was looking well, she left the peaches, we had 15 minutes of pleasant conversation, and she went away. Mabel looked at the desert. She didn't say anything unkind. I think she was looking for something to disapprove of and not finding it. Good, said Celeste. Let her keep looking. What Mabel didn't say, because she was still in the habit of keeping certain things close, was that she'd thought about this. About the town softening, about Agnes Whitmore's peaches, about the way people at the general store had stopped pausing in their conversations and started greeting her. And she'd tried to understand what had changed. Not her appearance, obviously. She was larger than she'd ever been, moving through her last trimester in the Arizona summer, not anyone's picture of a frontier heroine, What had changed was something else, and it had taken her a while to name it. She had stopped waiting for their approval. That was the whole of it. Somewhere between the root cellar and the water rights, and Dewey's arm, and the county hearing, she had gotten too busy to spend energy on what Red Mesa thought of her, and in the absence of that attention, the town had reorganized its opinion without being asked. People, she was learning, tended to take you at your own assessment if you held it long enough and consistently enough without flinching. She had not solved this overnight. She was not entirely solved yet. The voice in her father's cadence still came, still had her father's specific gift for knowing exactly which doubts to press. But it was competing now with a fuller record, and the fuller record was getting harder to argue with. August brought the first real storm of her life on the frontier, and it nearly undid everything. It started as a change in the air on a Tuesday afternoon, a quality of pressure that the land seemed to read before she did. Gideon came in from the west pasture around 3 in the afternoon, moving faster than his usual pace, and she looked at him from the kitchen doorway and said, "What's wrong?" "Weather coming. Bad one, I think. Sky's wrong to the north." He was already out of the storage room checking the supply situation. "I need to get the herd into the east paddock before it hits." "How long do we have?" 4 or 5 hours, maybe. Could be less." She went to the kitchen and began banking the food and securing anything that could blow. She'd learned this, not from experience, but from listening to Hatch talk about past storms, from reading what she could find, from paying the kind of attention that substitutes for experience when you don't have it yet. She tied down the garden frames she'd built in spring. She brought the loose tools in from the yard. She checked the shutters on the south side, the ones that had been giving trouble since winter, and she drove the loose one home with a hammer and a nail that she hoped would hold. Gideon and Dewey and Hatch moved the herd. It took 3 hours and went badly in the middle when part of the cattle pushed back against the paddock gate, and they lost 20 minutes managing the panic. And she watched from the porch for part of it because she was not stupid enough to be in the middle of frightened cattle in her condition, and she cataloged what she could see and couldn't help with, and made herself stay where she was. By 7 in the evening, the storm was visible. Not rain yet, but the sky to the north was a color she'd never seen before, a greenish dark that looked wrong in the way of things that precede serious damage. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in an hour. The wind started. The wind was the part she hadn't understood from description. It wasn't like normal wind. It was a sustained pressure, a physical thing, and it found every gap in the house and spoke through them in a register that was more felt than heard. The shutters she'd nailed held. 3 that Gideon had checked the previous month held less well, and one eventually let go entirely on the north side of the barn. They were all inside by 9. The storm proper arrived around 10, and she sat at the kitchen table with the lamp and the account ledger, and did not accomplish anything in the ledger but kept it open in front of her as an object of focus, while the world outside made a sustained noise that she worked hard not to read as catastrophic. Gideon was at the table too. Hatch and Dewey were in the bunkhouse, which was solid. Hatch had been in Arizona longer than anyone, and he'd built his assessment of the bunkhouse's weather-worthiness over many seasons. "You all right?" Gideon asked her, around 11. "I'm fine." She looked at the ledger. "How bad do you think it'll be?" "This kind usually runs 8 to 10 hours. The cattle should be all right in the east paddock. The gate's strong." He was looking at the ceiling, listening to something she didn't have the trained ear to read. "The barn roof is the question. I had the north section redone in spring, but the south section is old timber. If the south section goes, then we have a significant problem and a significant expense." He was quiet. "But it's held before." She nodded. She put her hand on the table, not to hold anything, just to feel the solid wood of it, and he put his hand down too, a few inches from hers, and they sat that way in the lamplight with the storm doing what it was doing outside, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then she moved her hand and put it over his. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they stayed that way for a long time, not talking, just weathering it together, which was about the most honest description of a marriage she'd ever encountered. Around 2 in the morning, the character of the storm changed, not stopping but shifting, the pressure easing fractionally, the voice of it dropping a register. She realized she had been holding herself rigid without knowing it, and she let go of something in her shoulders. "Passing," Gideon said. "You can tell?" "Experience." He was still holding her hand. "Another couple hours and we'll be able to look at what it did." She pressed her free hand to her side. The baby had been moving since the storm started. Not dramatically, not alarmingly, just with the general restlessness of someone who senses that the world is unsettled. She had not mentioned this because there was nothing to do about it, and mentioning it would have put Gideon in the position of worrying about something he had no power to address. He noticed her hand on her side. "How are you feeling?" "Fine," she paused. "He's been active." "He?" It was the first time she'd used the pronoun with certainty. She considered. "I don't know, I just think so." He looked at her hand on her side and then at her face. "Mabel." "I'm fine, Gideon. Women have been having babies in bad weather for as long as there have been both." "That's not—" He stopped, let out a breath. "That's not exactly a comforting statement." "I know, I meant it practically, not comfortingly." He kept looking at her. She kept her face even, which was not the same as feeling even, but she had learned that in difficult moments, one of them needed to be the steady point, and that she was often better at it than he was. Not because she was less afraid, but because she'd had more practice translating fear into usefulness. "Go check on the barn when it's light enough," she said. "I'll have breakfast ready." He looked at her for another moment. Then he squeezed her hand once and let it go. The damage was real but not disastrous. The south section of the barn roof had lost 2 panels and taken water, which damaged some stored feed and soaked through to the corner where they kept equipment. 3 fence sections on the west boundary were down. A storage shed at the back of the property had partially collapsed, though it had been the weakest structure on the land, and she had written structural assessment needed in her maintenance notes the previous fall. They spent 3 days in the immediate aftermath doing triage. What could wait? What couldn't? What needed outside help? She managed the accounts through it, recalculating what repairs would cost against what they had, what could be deferred and what had to be addressed before fall. Gideon and Hatch did the physical assessment, and Dewey did the fence work because he was fastest at it, and she coordinated from the kitchen table where she could see what was happening and track against the budget in real time. On the 4th day after the storm, she came in from a morning walk along the east fence line, a habit she'd kept through the pregnancy, slower now but persistent. And she felt something different. Not pain exactly, not yet, but something changed and definitive in the quality of how her body was operating. And she stood at the porch steps and took stock of herself with the clear-eyed practicality of a woman who did not have time to panic. She was 8 months along. It was too early. She went inside. Gideon was at the table with the barn repair estimate from the lumber yard in Red Mesa. "I need you to ride to Red Mesa," she said. He looked up at her tone. He was on his feet before she finished the sentence. "Dr. Kane," she said, "bring him out." His face went still and then into motion, both at once. "How close?" "I don't know, maybe not today, but I don't want to wait until I do know and it's too late to get him here." She sat down carefully. "Go now. Take the fast horse." He was already at the door. He stopped and looked back at her. "Hatch," he called out toward the barn. Then to her, "I'll send Dewey in before I leave." "I'm all right." "Dewey comes in," he said. The tone was not arguable. She let it stand. "Go," she said. "Ride fast." He went. The long day that followed was the test she hadn't studied for. Dewey sat in the kitchen with her and tried not to look terrified, which she appreciated. Hatch came in and out with the specific restlessness of a man who handles crisis through activity and had run out of activities. She managed what she could manage, which was the breathing and the waiting and the periodic nature of what her body was deciding to do. And she did not let herself think too far ahead because she had learned that fear of the future is only useful when there's something in the present that can address it. It took Gideon 4 hours to get to Red Mesa and back with Dr. Kane, which she knew because she counted. She counted other things too. The spaces between, the quality and character of each, the things her mother had told her once in a brief and practical conversation that she had memorized without knowing she'd need it. Dr. Kane came in with his bag and his unhurried professional manner, and he examined her and he said, "Early, but not dangerously so. We're going to work with what we have." "Is he all right?" she said. Not herself. The baby. "Let's see what we're doing first," said Dr. Kane. Gideon stayed. She had told him he didn't have to, and he had looked at her as though she'd said something in a language he didn't recognize, and he had sat in the chair in the corner of her room, with the bolt on the inside of the door that she did not use tonight. And he stayed. There were hours in between that were the hardest work she had ever done in her life, and she had done hard work. There were moments when the voice in her father's cadence tried to speak, and she simply did not have the resources to listen to it, which was perhaps the most effective silencing it had ever received. At some point in the long, dark middle of it, she said, "Talk to me. About anything." Gideon, from the chair, said, "About what?" "Anything. The ranch, the cattle, the barn roof. Anything." So he talked. He talked about the spring cattle count and the calf numbers and what he thought the fall market would look like. He talked about a fence repair technique Hatch had shown him years ago that he still used. He talked, haltingly, about a horse he'd had when he first came to Arizona that had been the best horse he'd ever known, and that had died in the drought year of '80, and she could hear in the way he talked about it that this was not something he'd told many people. She listened, and she breathed, and she did the work. Near dawn, as the desert outside the window began to separate itself from the night, Dr. Kane said, "There you go, Mrs. Cross," in the tone of a man who has seen this outcome before and never takes it for granted, and the sound that came next was the sound that divided everything that had come before it from everything that would come after, small, indignant, entirely alive. She heard Gideon make a sound from the chair. Not a word, not anything that was a word. And she looked at the ceiling, and she breathed, and she let herself feel, for once, the full force of something good without bracing for the correction. "A boy," said Dr. Kane. "Small but sound." She held him, and he was not beautiful in the way of things described in books. He was red-faced and wrinkled and furious about his situation, which she thought showed extremely good judgment. And she held him, and she felt the accumulated weight of 24 years of being told she was too much and not enough lift by exactly the measure of what was in her arms. Gideon came and stood beside the bed and looked at them both, and he did not say anything for a long moment, and she did not require him to. Then he said, "He's got your forehead." She looked at the baby. She could not evaluate this claim objectively. "Let's hope that's all he got from me," she said. "Let's not," Gideon said quietly. She looked up at him. He was looking at the baby, but he said it like he meant it about her, and she had enough left in her at that moment to receive it, just barely, just enough. Outside, the desert was turning light in the way it turned light. Not gradually, not with ceremony, just decisively. The darkness folding back and the land appearing in its full flat distance. The colors coming in where there had been none. The world reasserting itself as something solid and real and indifferent to the extraordinary things that happened in small rooms within it. Dewey's voice came from outside the door, barely contained. Is everyone... It's a boy," Gideon called back. A sound from Dewey that defied transcription. From farther away, from outside, Hatch's voice, dry and flat. "Boy or girl?" "Boy." A pause, then, "Good." She almost laughed. She was too tired, but the shape of it was there. She held her son in the new morning, and she thought that this, all of it, the imperfect, difficult, exhausting, real entirety of it, was hers, and she had built it, and it had not been smooth, and it had not been beautiful, and it had cost her everything she had, and it was hers. They named him Thomas. Not after anyone in particular. She had no family name she wanted to carry forward, and Gideon's family history was complicated in ways he didn't often speak about. Thomas was simply a name that sounded solid. A name that could belong to a man who worked with his hands, or a man who kept accounts, or both at once. She said it the first morning while the baby was sleeping on her chest, and the room smelled like exhaustion, and Dr. Kane had finally gone to sleep in the front room, and Gideon said it back to her like he was testing the weight of it, and they agreed. Thomas Cross, named for nothing behind him. Built for whatever was ahead. The first weeks were the hardest and the strangest in equal measure. She had thought she knew hard work. She had been wrong about the specific category of it that a newborn represents. The way it disassembles your sense of time and replaces it with something that runs on a different logic entirely, organized not by hours but by hunger and sleep, and the particular quality of a cry that you learn to read the way you learn any language, through immersion and exhaustion and no alternative. She was not graceful at it. She wanted to say that clearly, if only to herself. She was not one of those women who took to motherhood with seamless ease, who seemed to have always known the movements and the rhythms. She fumbled. She second-guessed. There were nights in the first month when Thomas would not settle, and she sat in the rocking chair that Gideon had moved into her room without announcement, and she felt the old voice rising. Not capable enough, not natural enough, too big and too uncertain for even this most fundamental thing. She told it to be quiet and kept rocking. Gideon was not what she'd expected, which was the pattern of her life with him, constant small revisions to expectations she'd formed too quickly. He was not the kind of man who instinctively knew what to do with an infant, and he didn't pretend otherwise. But he showed up. That was the whole of it, delivered without theater. He showed up every time, and he figured it out through the same combination of attention and stubbornness that he applied to everything else. He took Thomas in the early morning so she could sleep an unbroken 2 hours. He heated water without being asked. He learned through trial and the kind of air that produces real knowledge. Which sounds meant something was wrong, and which sounds were simply Thomas's commentary on the general state of existence. Dewey was hopeless around the baby in the best possible way. Terrified, delighted, incapable of being in the same room without making some kind of face that Thomas appeared to find either fascinating or alarming, possibly both. Hatch held Thomas exactly once, in the 3rd week, standing in the kitchen doorway with the baby in his arms, in the careful way of a man who handles fragile things by respecting their weight. He looked at Thomas for a long moment, and then handed him back to Mabel and said, "Healthy," like a diagnosis, and went back outside. "That's the most emotion I've ever seen from Hatch," Dewey said later. "He said one word," Mabel said. For Hatch, one word is a speech. By October, Thomas was 6 weeks old. The desert was cooling into the bearable version of itself, and the ranch had survived the summer and the storm damage and the legal fight and the birth all in the same year. Mabel sat down with the accounts and did the full annual calculation. It was not a triumphant set of numbers. The barn roof repair had cost more than projected because the lumber price had risen between estimate and purchase. The legal fees for Reardon had drawn the operating reserve down further than she liked. The storm had destroyed stored feed that had to be replaced at late-season prices, which were punishing. Against all of that, the spring cattle sale had gone well. Better than the previous year, partly because the herd was in better condition than it had been in some years, partly because Mabel had done enough market research through the fall and winter to know which buyers in Tucson were paying fair prices and which were not. And she had told Gideon which ones to approach. The net position was not comfortable, but it was not desperate. They were solvent. They were provisioned for winter. The water rights were settled, and the herd count was up from where she'd found it 14 months ago. She wrote all of this down in the ledger and looked at the numbers for a long time, and then she closed it. She thought about a woman who had been told her whole life that she was a burden, that she consumed more than she contributed, that the space she occupied in any room was a subtraction from what the room could otherwise hold. She thought about what the numbers actually said. Then she put the ledger on the desk where Gideon could see it and went to feed Thomas, who had opinions about being made to wait. Dale Hurst came one more time. It was November, a cold, clear day, and she was on the porch with Thomas in a wrap she'd fashioned from a blanket because it kept her hands free and kept him warm, and she was not willing to spend an entire Arizona winter being unable to do 2 things at once. She heard the wagon and watched it come up the drive and recognized the rig and stood and waited. Hurst climbed down. He looked at her on the porch. He looked at the baby and the wrap. He looked at the ranch, at the repaired barn, at the fence lines that Dewey had rebuilt after the storm, at the garden that was put to bed for winter, but clearly had been productive, at the water tower and the corral and the general air of a property that was functional and maintained. He took off his hat. She had not expected that. "Mrs. Cross," he said. "Mr. Hurst." She didn't move from the porch. "Is your husband around?" "He's in the south pasture. I can send for him, or you can tell me what you came to say." Hurst looked at her for a moment. He was recalculating something. She could see it. The same calculation she'd watched him run the first time he'd come. But the variables had changed, and the result was coming out different. "I came to let you know I won't be pursuing the territorial court appeal," he said. "On the creek matter." She kept her face even. "All right. The commissioner's ruling stands." He turned his hat in his hands, a gesture she hadn't seen from him before, a small concession to something. "I also want to say, And I want to be clear, I'm saying this to you directly and not to your husband, that the field notes argument was well constructed. Reardon's a competent lawyer, but that was a document strategy. She looked at him. Is there a point to this, Mr. Hurst? He almost smiled. The point is that I underestimated what I was dealing with when I came out here in January. I don't often make that mistake. He put his hat back on. I won't make it again with you. He climbed back into his wagon. His hand turned it around. She watched them go down the drive and out through the gate, and she stood on the porch with Thomas sleeping in the wrap against her chest and the November wind moving across the desert. And she thought about what it meant that a man like Dale Hurst had driven 4 hours to say that to her face. She decided it meant exactly what it appeared to mean, no more and no less. He was a man who respected what he'd lost too and wanted her to know he'd identified it correctly. That wasn't warmth. It wasn't friendship. It was a kind of professional acknowledgement between adversaries, and she received it as that and nothing more. She went inside and put Thomas down and wrote the visit in the household log, the same way she recorded everything, matter-of-factly, with a date and a summary. And then she made coffee. When Gideon came in that evening, she told him about the visit. He sat down slowly. He drove out here himself to tell you he was dropping the appeal, and to say the document strategy was well done. Gideon looked at the table. He was quiet for a moment. Dale Hurst doesn't drive 4 hours to say things that aren't calculated. I know. He came so you'd know he'd identified you as the reason he lost. Yes. That's not a compliment. That's him telling you he knows who to watch. She poured his coffee. I know that too. She set the cup down. But he's also telling me he's done fighting this particular ground. He's a practical man. He lost and he knows why, and he's moving on. She sat down across from him. We should move on too. The creek is ours. What do we do with that? He looked at her over his coffee. What do you mean? The North Pasture has been underused because the water access was uncertain. It's not uncertain anymore. She had been thinking about this for weeks. If we run a line from the creek to the far corner of the North Pasture, we open up another 40 acres of grazing. That's room for another 30 to 40 head without overworking the land. He was quiet, looking at her, in the particular way he had when he was doing the terrain calculations in his head. The line would take the spring, he said. Labor and materials. I've got a preliminary cost in the ledger. Look at it tonight. He reached for the ledger she'd left on the desk. He opened it to where she'd marked the page and read. She watched him read. This is, he said, and stopped. It pencils out by the 3rd year if the cattle prices hold near where they've been. He kept reading. She drank her coffee. You worked this out when? He said. August. Then I updated it after the storm costs came in. In August, you were 8 months pregnant and we were in the middle of a legal fight and recovering from a storm. I had the evenings. He looked at her. She looked back at him. In the front room, Thomas made a sound that was not quite a cry, but was advisory in nature. And she stood and went to him and picked him up and came back to the kitchen with him and sat down. And Gideon watched all of this and then looked back at the ledger. Spring, he said. We'd need to start the line in spring. That's what I thought. He closed the ledger. He picked up his coffee. He looked at her across the table with the baby in her arms and the lamp between them and the account ledger closed with its plans inside it. And he had the expression she'd seen before but not often, the one she still didn't have a complete name for, that lived somewhere between gratitude and recognition and something older and quieter than either. I keep thinking, he said, about what this place looked like before you got here. I know what it looked like. I've seen the records. I'm not talking about the records. He set the cup down. I'm talking about... He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. She waited. I came out here 11 years ago and I built this from nothing and I kept it going and I thought that was enough. That keeping it going was the whole job. He looked at the table. You've been here 14 months and I can see what it could be. Not just surviving, actually, what it could be. She looked at Thomas, who was examining his own fist with the concentration of someone discovering an important fact. You would have gotten there, she said. It was what she always said, and she half believed it. Maybe. He looked at her directly. But not like this. She didn't argue with it. She let it stand the way she was slowly learning to let good things stand without immediately building a case against them. The second winter was different from the first. Not easier exactly. The frontier did not become easier in the way of a thing that has been mastered because it could not be mastered, and any rancher who believed otherwise had not been there long enough. But she moved through it differently. She knew its rhythms now in her body, not just in her mind. She knew which cold was routine and which signaled real danger. She knew which sounds the barn made when it was simply settling and which meant something needed checking. She knew the way the cattle behaved in the 2 days before a weather change, the restlessness that was more reliable than any barometer. Thomas grew with the winter in the way of babies, the sudden lurches of development that seem impossible and then immediately seem like they could not have been otherwise. He was not an easy baby. She'd heard women talk about easy babies, and she was fairly certain Thomas was not one, because he had opinions about everything and expressed them without reservation and regarded the world with a suspicious intensity that she found she recognized. "He looks at everything like he's calculating something," Dewey said once, watching Thomas consider a wooden spoon with great suspicion. "He probably is," she said. "He gets that from you." She didn't deny it. Celeste came through in late November with all 3 of her children and spent 2 days, and the house was fuller and louder than it had ever been, and she found to her own surprise that she did not find this difficult. She found it, and she turned this over carefully, not trusting it too quickly. She found it good. The noise and the crowding and the children underfoot and Celeste's oldest, the 9-year-old Menace, who immediately identified the account ledger as the most interesting object in the house and had to be redirected with considerable diplomacy. "She wants to look at the numbers," the girl said, with the straight-faced certainty of a child who does not understand why this requires redirection. "The numbers are private," Mabel said. "Why?" "Because they belong to this household." The girl considered this. "When I have a household, can I look at the numbers?" "Yes," Mabel said. "You absolutely can." Celeste caught her eye from across the room, and they shared the particular look of 2 women who understand something about the child that the child doesn't yet know about herself. Agnes Whitmore organized what she called a community gathering in December, which was the territory's version of a social event. People from 3 or 4 properties, the minister from Red Mesa, a few town families, gathered at a property large enough to hold them, which in this case was the Whitmore Ranch. She invited Gideon and Mabel with a note that was, for Agnes, almost warm. Mabel almost didn't go. It was cold, and Thomas was at the age where public situations were unpredictable, and she had never in her life found large social gatherings to be comfortable. And the specific kind of gathering organized by Agnes Whitmore promised a particular density of scrutiny that she had limited appetite for. She went anyway, because she was tired of letting discomfort win. What she found was not what she'd prepared for. She'd prepared for assessment, the collective gaze of a community taking inventory of who she was and whether she measured up to what they'd expected or feared or gossiped about. What she found instead was something more ordinary and more disarming. People who had heard about the water rights case and wanted to ask about it directly. Women who had questions about winter stores that they'd apparently been wanting to ask someone practical and had identified her as a useful source. A rancher from east of Red Mesa named Kessler, who had been watching the Hearst situation because he had a similar water access question on his own property and wanted to know about Reardon. She talked to Kessler for 20 minutes about the documentation process and the importance of the field notes and what to look for in the county records. She talked to 2 women about root cellaring. She answered questions about the cattle loss records and the herd rotation system, and at some point she was standing in Agnes Whitmore's parlor with Thomas on her hip, deep in conversation with 4 people who were all asking her things she actually knew the answers to, and she realized she had not thought about how she looked or how much space she was taking up in the past 2 hours. Agnes appeared at her elbow at one point with a cup of coffee. "You're very patient with Kessler," Agnes said. "He's asked me the same question about water rights 3 times since October. He needed the practical information, not the legal summary." Agnes looked at her. She had the expression of a woman performing a long-running internal revision. "You've had quite a first year." "It's been a full one." "The water rights, the baby." Agnes glanced at Thomas, who was regarding a nearby stranger with his characteristic suspicious intensity. "The storm." She paused. I heard you managed the birth preparation yourself when Gideon went for the doctor. Dewey was there. Dewey, Agnes said, in a tone that communicated her full assessment of Dewey's capacity to be useful in a medical situation. He was more useful than you'd think. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then, I said some things when you arrived, Mrs. Cross, about Constitution, about what this life requires. You did? I wasn't entirely wrong about the life, but I was wrong about you. She said it without drama, without excessive apology. The statement of someone who has made peace with a miscalculation and is moving on. I hope you'll come to the spring gathering as well. I expect we will, Mabel said. Agnes nodded and went to manage someone else, which was clearly her primary occupation in life and which she performed with genuine competence. Spring arrived again and the North Pasture water line was built over 3 weeks in April, Gideon and Hatch doing the heavy work while she managed the schedule and the supply chain, and Thomas sat in the shade in the carrier she'd built for exactly this purpose, watching the construction with the focused interest of a child who appears to be storing information for later use. 32 additional head of cattle were moved into the open pasture by June. The North Pasture, which had been underused for years because the water access question made it unreliable, became the strongest grazing section on the property. The calculation she'd worked out in August of the previous year, updated for storm costs and adjusted for real materials prices, proved within $11 of what they actually spent. She did not make a point of this, but she noted it. It is worth saying something true here because this story has been told, in the way that all stories eventually are, carried along by people who knew or half knew or heard from someone who heard, and the version that travels tends to be the one that makes the most narrative sense. The one where a woman arrived and transformed a ranch and earned a community's respect and proved something clear and definitive about worth and resilience and what a person can do when given a chance. That version is not wrong exactly. It just leaves out the part where it was difficult in ways that didn't resolve, where the voice in her father's cadence kept coming back even when she'd won things, where she made mistakes that cost real money and took real time to fix, where there were weeks when she looked at what she'd built and felt proud of it, and weeks when she looked at exactly the same thing and felt only the distance between what it was and what she feared it should be. She was not healed by the frontier. The frontier doesn't heal anyone. It's not in the business of healing. It's in the business of presenting you with conditions that require your full self every day, without exception. And what you discover about yourself in that process is yours to keep or argue with as you see fit. What she discovered about herself was this: she had always been capable. The capability had always been there. It had been there when she was a girl doing her father's accounts at the kitchen table. It had been there when she was organizing a root cellar nobody had asked her to organize. It had been there when she found the survey document and thought to look for field notes and wrote a summary that got cited by name in a county commissioner's report. The capability was not something she developed in Arizona. It was something Arizona stopped hiding. The place couldn't have hidden it forever. Eventually, it would have found its way out one way or another, because capability is not a thing that disappears under pressure. It's a thing that pressure reveals. She just got here sooner. She got here because she bought a train ticket at 2 in the morning and wrote a letter to a stranger who said he was looking for a partner, and meant it. Thomas was 2 years old when Hatch retired. Not retired exactly. Hatch did not use that word and would not have recognized its application to himself. What happened was that the winter of 1886 was harder than most, and his joints made their position clear in a language that couldn't be argued with. And one morning in February, he came to the kitchen and stood in the doorway and told Mabel, not Gideon, that he thought it was time to see about his sister in New Mexico. She looked at him for a moment. "When are you thinking?" she said. "Spring, when the worst of the cold is past." "All right." She got up and poured him coffee because his hands were stiff in the mornings. "Sit down, Hatch." He sat. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "You could stay," she said. "There's always a place here." "I know." He drank. "My sister's got grandchildren. They're getting old enough to be useful and young enough to be annoying. I figure I've got a few more years in me, and I'd rather spend them on that than on cattle." She understood this. She didn't argue with it. "I'll write you a reference," she said, "for any work you want in New Mexico. A proper one, with the ranch accounts attached, so anyone who receives it knows what it's worth." He looked at her. "That's not necessary." I know it's not necessary. I'm doing it because it's accurate and because you've earned it. She held his gaze. Don't tell me not to. He was quiet for a moment, then, all right. He left in April, on a clear morning when the desert was beginning its brief season of color, and Thomas stood on the porch and watched the wagon go with the focused attention he gave to everything. Gideon shook Hatch's hand for a long time. Dewey, who had always been slightly afraid of Hatch, and deeply admiring of him in equal measure, managed a few words that were more coherent than she'd expected. When the wagon was out of sight, she went back inside and sat at the kitchen table and let herself feel the particular shape of the absence. Hatch had been there when she arrived, the weathered man with the carved face who had moved heavy sacks without being asked, and told Gideon that her correction of the paddock rotation was cleaner than what he'd seen before. She owed him a debt she couldn't name specifically, but knew exactly. She hoped his sister's grandchildren were terrible, and that he was happier than he'd ever let on. They hired 2 new hands over the following year. A quiet man named Aurelio, who had worked cattle in Sonora and knew things about drought management that proved immediately useful, and a young woman named Pearl, who arrived looking for work and whom Mabel hired on the spot when she asked 3 questions in a row that demonstrated she'd been paying careful attention to how ranches actually ran rather than how people talked about them running. Gideon looked at her after Pearl left the yard on her first day. You hired her because she asked the right questions, he said. I hired her because she'll be useful, Mabel said. The questions told me that. He nodded slowly. He had learned, over 2.5 years, to trust her hiring judgment over his own, which had been a significant concession for a man who had been running his own operation for over a decade. He'd made it without drama, which she appreciated. He just started asking her opinion, and then following it, and they both understood what that meant without making it into a conversation. Pearl turned out to be excellent. She had a gift with horses that Dewey cheerfully described as supernatural, and that Aurelio described more practically as the result of knowing how to be still, which was rarer than most people understood. The ranch was not the same place it had been 3 years ago. This was true in the measurable ways: the herd count, the pasture use, the account balance, the organization of everything from the root cellar to the legal documentation file she maintained with the care of a courthouse clerk. It was also true in the ways that don't appear in ledgers, the quality of attention paid to it, the sense that it was a place that knew what it was and what it was trying to be. People came to Mabel Cross with questions. This was the change that surprised her most when she turned around and noticed it had happened. Kessler, who had asked about water rights at the Whitmore gathering, came back 2 more times with other questions and then started sending other ranchers with the casual efficiency of a man who has identified a reliable source. Celeste always, but now also Celeste's neighbors to the north, who had their own questions about land records and cattle management and how to organize a household account that could survive a hard year. Agnes Whitmore asked her, at the spring gathering in 1886, if she would be willing to speak at the next community meeting about winter store preparation, and Mabel said yes because there was no reason not to, and because the information was useful, and she'd learned it through real experience, which was the only valid curriculum. She was not comfortable with any of this in the way of a person who enjoys being deferred to. She remained, constitutionally, someone who preferred the problem to the recognition, who found the doing more natural than the receiving. But she had learned, slowly, imperfectly, through many small acts of choosing to stand still when the old reflex said to make herself smaller, that allowing other people to receive what you have to give is also a form of competence, that refusing the acknowledgement doesn't make you humble. It just makes you unavailable. The last time she thought about her father in the specific way she had thought about him in those early months, she was sitting on the porch in the evening of a September day in 1887, 4 years after she'd stepped off a stagecoach and looked up and down the main street of Red Mesa while 3 men watched. Thomas was 3, asleep inside, wearing himself out the way he did everything, completely. Gideon was somewhere in the property's evening rounds. The habit he had of finishing the day with a walk through whatever needed checking, which was a habit she no longer tried to talk him out of because she had understood by now that it was his way of belonging to the place, of renewing the connection to it every evening before he slept. She was sitting with the account ledger, which was where she often sat in the evenings, and the numbers for the current year were good. Not exceptional. Not the kind of year you told stories about. The kind of year where everything that was supposed to work worked. The planning held. The contingencies she'd built into the budget weren't needed, and at the end of it, there was something left over. The most honest kind of success, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that just appears in the final column as a number that is larger than zero and growing. She looked at the number, and she thought about her father. Not the specific cruelties. She had processed those a long time ago, turned them over and put them down. Not because she'd forgiven him, but because carrying them was expensive and she had better uses for the energy. She thought instead about a specific thing he'd said when she was 17, when she'd corrected a calculation error in his accounts, and he'd looked at her with an expression she'd never entirely been able to decode, some combination of things she couldn't name. And he'd said, "You're too smart for your own good, girl." Like it was an accusation, like her intelligence was a quality she'd acquired to inconvenience him specifically. She had believed him for a long time, not consciously, not the way you believe a thing you've examined and agreed with. The way you believe a thing that was told to you young enough that it became part of the structure before you had any choice about the architecture. What she understood now, sitting on the porch of a ranch in the Arizona territory with a healthy ledger in her lap and a sleeping son inside and a husband making his evening rounds, was that he had been afraid of her. That was the thing she'd never seen as a child, because children can't see that. They can't see that an adult's contempt for them is sometimes the shape that fear takes when it has nowhere else to go. He had looked at a daughter who was smarter than he was, and he had called it a problem. And she had carried that framing for 24 years before she arrived somewhere that called it an asset and meant it. She thought, that is the real cost of it. Not what it took from her. She could inventory that. She'd done it. It was real. But what it cost the years when the capability was there and had nowhere useful to go, when she was being efficient and methodical and careful in a house where those qualities were not wanted and not seen. She did not know how to get those years back. You didn't. That was the honest truth of it. And she had made her peace with the honest truth. You didn't get the years back, you just made sure the next ones were different. Thomas would grow up here. He would grow up watching a woman run accounts and argue water rights and hire workers and make decisions and be wrong sometimes and right often and never once be told that her intelligence was a problem. He would grow up watching Gideon Cross treat his wife's judgment as something to be consulted rather than overridden. He would grow up thinking that was simply what a household looked like, which meant it would be what he expected from the world and what he would build when he built his own. That was the ledger that didn't fit in a book. That was the number that was larger than zero and growing. Ooh. Gideon came back from his evening rounds as the light was going, the way he always did, and he came up to the porch and looked at her and looked at the ledger in her lap. "Good or bad?" he said. He meant the numbers. "Good," she said. "Sit down." He sat in the chair beside her. He smelled like horses and outside air and the particular smell of a man who has worked all day and is at the end of it satisfied. She had come to know this smell the way she'd come to know the sounds the barn made, as information, as familiar as anything in her life. "Hatch wrote," he said. "His sister's grandson took to ranching. He says it's like watching himself at 20. That's either a compliment or a warning. From Hatch, hard to know." He leaned back in the chair. The desert evening was doing what desert evenings did. The sky turning colors that she still couldn't quite believe were real. The air cooling fast. The stars beginning at the edges the way they did out here. Appearing not gradually, but in a sudden population, as though they'd been there all along and were only now willing to be seen. She closed the ledger. "The north pasture numbers are better than I projected," she said. "I saw the cattle this morning. They look good. Pearl thinks the east herd is ready to cull for the fall market. She's probably right. She usually is." They sat in the quiet of it. From inside, Thomas made a sound in his sleep. Not distress, just the sound of a child present in his own dreaming. And then was quiet again. She thought about a woman who had packed a carpet bag and a small trunk and stood on a platform in Louisville with a ticket west and felt, for the first time she could remember, like a person going somewhere. That woman had been her, and she was still her, and the distance between that platform and this porch was not a transformation. She had not become someone different. She had become more fully someone she had always been, which is a different and more durable thing. She did not know what came next. That was the truth she'd made her peace with. The frontier offered no guarantees, and she had stopped wanting them. What she wanted was this: the season's work well done, a ledger that told the truth, A household that functioned because everyone in it was treated as though their competence was expected and their contribution mattered. A child who would grow up with different stories in his head than the ones she'd started with. She could see it clearly, all of it, imperfect and real and hers. Gideon, she said. Thank you for the letter. She meant the letter from 4 years ago, the one that had said, I am not looking for a pretty ornament, I am looking for a partner. He was quiet for a moment. You would have found your way somewhere, he said. Maybe. She looked at the stars. But I found my way here. That's the one that mattered. He didn't say anything after that. Neither did she. The night came in the way it always did over the Arizona desert. Not slowly, not with apology, just completely, full of stars from one edge to the other. And they sat in it together, the two of them, in the ordinary, extraordinary quiet of a life that had been built by hand, out of hard seasons and stubbornness, and the particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the inside, that looks from the inside like simply continuing to do the next necessary thing. That is what it had been. That is what it was. She was still there in the morning. She always would be.